Welcome to week 2 of Pat Psychology Masters. It was a brilliant week, incredibly information heavy, so I'm just going to try and touch on some of the different things I learned without going into too much detail on any one thing. My classes in social psychology, lifespan development, cognition, research methods, biopsychology were just fascinating, were very, very, very interesting. And I'm going to look at social psychology first, and a lot of the topics that I touch on are going to be a little bit of a development from what I started discussing last week. So, taking first of all the publishing bias that I mentioned last week. If you wish to look this up further, it's also called the filing drawer problem, which references how negative results are often delegated to the filing drawer. They don't reach public consumption. They don't reach the body of research which other people dip in and dip out of. So it's a big issue in psychology at the moment, the preference for positive results in publishing, and it makes sense, but it's an unfortunate aspect of the human condition when it concerns research, because we're not really seeing a lot of disconfirming results. So anytime there's a hypothesis posed, a question posed, well, we're only going to get shocking answers to that question, or answers which confirm the hypothesis, which confirm the alternative hypothesis, which isn't ideal in terms of understanding science as a whole, because so much science is about trying to disprove your hypothesis and succeeding, and you don't get the result you might have expected, and that's science. The science that we see in the different publications where you're seeing lots and lots of positive results, that's not a fair representation of what science is, and it actually does the field harm. So I'm going to put the filing drawer problem aside, and now I'm going to talk about our hindsight biases. So a great example of this is when we give people cliches to look at, and depending on their experience, they're going to select a particular cliche which reflects more so on that experience. So for instance, birds of a feather flock together. Somebody might say, oh yes, that's true, that's absolutely true, if they find that all of their friends are very similar to them, and they do most of their activities together. They're going to select that from personal experience, from their own hindsight. Whereas if you find somebody who has maybe friends that are very different to who they are, or maybe they have a romantic partner that works in a totally different field and has totally different interests, they might select, opposites attract, which is another cliche. And it just goes to show how people will select information based on their own experience, based on their own hindsight. So they're just two quick biases which highlight how our minds work, and how they don't work as rationally and as objectively as we might think they do. And it's important, I feel, to learn about biases so that we can combat our kind of more base tendencies, and maybe act more rationally and more objectively, and understand maybe our own limitations at times. Similar to the filing drawer problem I mentioned, there's another crisis. It's called a crisis in science, in social science at the moment, and it's called the replication crisis. And the replication crisis is this inability to replicate a lot of results that were found in different published papers. So what's feeding this replication crisis, the reasons are numerous, but for instance, one example is that if you're a researcher that's new to the field, you want to do new research. You want to do something that hasn't been done before. You don't want to look at the published research and then try and disconfirm it. Typically people aren't as interested in doing that as they are in doing something pioneering that will change the field. And yes, I think if you want to change the field, perhaps replicating a lot of studies and failing to do so will help change the field, because there is a change in attitudes towards towards social psychology, and if you want to legitimize it, it's important to be working in fact and not on a body of research which isn't testable and provable. And with that in mind, with the replication crisis, it just goes to show more reason to be skeptical. Skepticism is a very, very valuable philosophy. Do not believe everything you read. Verify what you're reading. Look at the methods. Did they do some dubious stuff? Does everything seem to have validity? You know, what are they generalizing the things that they learn from their lab experiment? Are they generalizing that to the outside world? Because that mightn't be an appropriate assumption to make. Maybe the information you learned in your experiment is only relevant to that lab paradigm, that lab setting. Maybe it's not generalizable to the outside world. So, depending on the researcher, if they're less rigorous, they might generalize to the outside world when that isn't appropriate. So remember to be skeptical when you're reading any sort of news article or any sort of scientific paper, because there are brilliantly intelligent people who do some fascinating work, and they are not skeptical enough. So it's up to you, the consumer, to be very, very skeptical of what you see and what you consume. Further evidence for the value of skepticism comes from Daryl Bem. So Daryl Bem is an incredibly influential social psychologist who's done some brilliant work in the field. But he published some fairly controversial research in 2011. I'm actually not even going to tell you what it was about, and that's for another bias which I'm going to talk about now, which is called recall bias. So recall bias gives insight into the utility of things like fake news and how we remember lies as truths. So if you hear something and you know it's not true, it's possible that you might quote that as evidence for an opinion you might have later on, and you've remembered it as fact, even though at the time you knew it to be untrue. And fascinatingly, the lead researcher in this field, from my understanding, appears to be a woman called Gillian Murphy from Cork. Gillian Murphy showed that during the 2016 abortion referendum in Ireland, that regardless of whether people read true or untrue information, they remembered the information that confirmed their opinions or that confirmed their ideas about the abortion referendum. So I'd highly recommend you look up Gillian Murphy on her research. It's brilliant stuff, and she's an Irish researcher as well, so it's great to support our own homegrown psychological talent. Getting back to another thing I mentioned about the generalisability of psychological studies, another reason to be skeptical of these studies is that typically the subjects are psychology students themselves. So I'm going to be conducting research now in the coming months, and I'm going to be looking for subjects for that research. And the easiest group of people that I will find to conduct the research on, the people who are going to be most willing, are people who are going to be interested in the subject and motivated to contribute to the research. And that typically comes in the form of a psychology undergrad or a psychology graduate student. So when we get results from this population, it's important to understand that, well, maybe we shouldn't be generalizing these results to people that aren't psychology students. Maybe the things we're discovering are particularly true for psychology students and not for people from other disciplines, from other streams of life, even from other cultures, which speaks to a limitation of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the DSM. The DSM is a statistical manual of health disorders used by psychologists and psychiatrists and people in the psychological field. This book is an incredibly important book for clinicians to help diagnose issues in different patients. And this book is typically contributed to by Western psychologists. And it's these psychologists that contribute to this book are typically working on people who are from Western civilization. And yet this book is being used to help diagnose mental disorders for people from all over the world, regardless of culture. So again, I just want to hammer home that point of how important it is to be skeptical. Another very interesting bias in science in general is that there can be a selection bias for our control and our experimental groups. Giving you an example, imagine I have a drug which I think has great potential to cure some of the most aggressive forms of cancer, okay? And I have 100 people, 70 of which have relatively aggressive cancer, 10 of which have quite aggressive cancer, and another 20 who have incredibly aggressive cancer. Well, when I'm setting up the study, I might want to put the patients with particularly aggressive cancer into my experimental group and not my control group, because in my bones I mightn't want to give somebody with incredibly aggressive cancer a sugar pill just to try and measure the efficacy of my cancer drug. If I really believe in this cancer drug, I will want to give it to the people with the most aggressive cancer. And if I don't give it to them, there's ethical issues. And if I give it to them, and if I select them for the experimental group, there's also ethical issues that arise there, because perhaps the study isn't as valid as it could be if I didn't do that, if I was to just randomly assign the control to one group of people and the drug to the other group of people. So there's just so many different biases that we have in our everyday life, and considering that these biases are an important factor in the human condition, we have to remember the people that are conducting the research are only human too, so many of these biases play an important role. Now, depending on how you set up the experiment, you can help mitigate against these biases, but it's, from my experience and from my understanding, practically impossible to mitigate all biases 100%. With that in mind, there's a really interesting Wikipedia page on all the different cognitive biases, and if you're interested in biases, I'd recommend you look that up. I'm going to, before I leave social psychology, I'm going to mention just a couple of different incredibly interesting and historically important social experiments. One of those is called the Milgram study. You may be familiar with this. The Milgram study was conducted, I believe it was in the 50s, after World War II, to try and understand how so many people in Nazi Germany could commit such atrocities. Milgram had this idea that there wasn't anything particularly evil about the German population. He felt that obedience was an important part of the human condition that could be generalizable to the American population as well, and perhaps if these American people grew up in Nazi Germany, they could be the people that were committing the atrocities that were committed during World War II. So the experiment he came up with was posed to participants as a learning and memory enhancement study. So he would get people in who would like to be involved, and he would tell them, okay, you're going to be the teacher, and we have another volunteer who's going to be the learner. Now, the teacher didn't realize that the learner was actually an actor. So the teacher posed questions to the learner. If the learner got that question wrong, the teacher would be instructed by the person who was overseeing the experiment to administer an electric shock to the learner. So, let's pretend I'm the teacher. You're the learner. I'm not in on it. You are. To my right, there's somebody supervising this experiment. I ask you a question. You answer it incorrectly. The person to my right says, okay, administer the electric shock. I administer the electric shock, and I hear, oh! I hear you wincing in pain. Now, I don't know that this is coming from an actor. I think that this is genuine. And I might feel a little bit shocked, and I might look to the experimenter and say, man, I don't enjoy this. Like, he's in pain. the experiment will go, everything is okay, proceed to the next question. So I proceed to the next question and I ask it, and if the person gets it wrong, I administer an electric shock again from the instruction of the supervisor. But the supervisor this time tells me to increase the voltage, and now I hear a larger wince of pain. This goes on and on until the electrical impulse, the electrocution which I administer to you, is fatal. I hear you screaming in pain, and then in the next instance, I don't hear you screaming at all, which suggests that you've probably lost consciousness. Most people were shown in the Milgram study to continue administering electrocution past the point when there was no more painful response, which would suggest that the person lost consciousness or even died, and the voltage that was being administered to the person was enough to kill them. Now, the learners were actors, and nobody was hurt in the physical sense, but obviously there was a lot of emotional trauma that the teachers went through, because they were shown how terrible they could act given certain circumstances, and it really shone light on this idea of obedience. So for you at home, think about that. You're likely to have obedient elements in your nature. So now that you know about it, can you counteract that? If somebody tells you to do something that you don't feel is right, will you step up, regardless if they're in a position of power? You should, but you mightn't. And I should, and I mightn't. So it's very interesting to think about. And if you want to learn more about that study, it's called the Milgram study. Another incredibly interesting study was the Asch conformity experiment. So this experiment is less messed up. In this experiment, we have an experimental subject, enter a room, and he's in a room with a lot of actors, Confederates. He doesn't know that these people are in on the study. He thinks that they're just experimental subjects, just like him, who are being asked a series of questions to discover more about a certain topic. He doesn't know that the research is actually about conformity. So, in the Asch experiment, the group are showed a piece of paper. And on this piece of paper, there are 3 lines on one side and 1 line on the other. The 3 lines on one side are of various lengths, and the line on the other side is of a particular length that matches with one of these, and it's quite obvious. So, people are asked, what line on the right hand side, is it A, B or C, that this line matches up with? Let's imagine it clearly matches up with C, and everybody says B. And when it comes to you, the experimental subject, you say, no, it's clearly C. And we go on to the next one. It's a new sheet. 1 line, 3 lines. Let's say it clearly matches with A this time. And everyone else says B again. And you're thinking, it's A. And then another sheet comes up. Again, you have a line, you have 3 lines. Let's say it obviously matches up with B this time. And people are saying, yeah, it's A. It's A. And you're looking around and you're thinking, it's A. It's A. And you'll see some very interesting videos on YouTube of this conformity experiment. And most people, they may, in the beginning, say what they know to be true, but typically they will eventually conform to the actors, to them saying the incorrect answer, and they'll just agree. Now, it's possible, the psychology behind that is very interesting. Are they actually changing what they see, or are they honestly lying? Or are they actually lying, I should say? It's a very interesting study. I encourage you to look into it more. Before I leave social psychology entirely, I'm going to mention a very interesting website called retractionwatch.com. On retractionwatch.com, you will see a lot of different studies which have been retracted recently. And it just goes to show how many experiments were done in a dubious manner or in an incorrect manner. And some of these studies are incredibly influential. I don't want to mention these studies for the reasons I mentioned earlier in terms of recall bias, but I think it's very informative for you to check that out. I'm going to have a quick overview of lifespan development now. Lifespan development is an area that I do not know much about and I have to do a lot of reading in. So I'm just going to touch on the different theories, and if you'd like to learn more about them, I'd encourage you to search for them online and look up different other YouTube videos. So there are a couple of historically important theories which have developed a lot today, but in the beginning they were fairly unusual and strange, and they mightn't have a lot of scientific validity today, but they've changed a lot. So look, I don't know much about them. I'm just going to give you a brief insight. So the psychodynamic theory, which I mentioned last week, was founded by Freud, looked at different stages of development, and they were typically quite sexualized. You're looking at the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage of all these different stages of development. And something interesting I learned this week is that when we describe somebody as anal, what the roots of that phrase lie in anal retentive, which describes a stage of development in psychodynamic theory, which the theory says that people will either shit everywhere or retain it. I'm butchering the idea, but if you are anal retentive, it means you're particularly in the confines of this theory. It means you're very specific about where you defecate. You haven't gotten any pleasure from defecating. You're very private about it, and that's why we describe people today as being anal if they're quite particular. It has its roots in psychodynamic theory. I'm going to park that aside. I've already butchered it. I'm not going to butcher it anymore and mention psychosocial theory, which was developed by a man named Erik Erikson. Great name. He also looked at different stages, and each of these stages had a conflict in them. And if that conflict wasn't resolved, a pathology would ensue. So I'll give you just one instance. In one of these stages, there is the conflict between trust and mistrust. So if we learn to trust our family and our parents and our environment, well, then we can move on to the next stage. But if we don't develop that trust and we mistrust, well, we are not going to properly move past that stage, and we are going to develop some type of a pathology. That's the psychosocial theory. Worth looking at, but remember, it's a historically important theory, and its applications today may have changed an awful lot. A very interesting experiment in developmental psychology, which falls under the bracket of social cognitive theory, is Bobo the doll. You may have heard of Bobo the doll and this experiment. And basically, this experiment had adults with a doll hugging it, rubbing its hair, taking good care of it, and all of this was done in front of children, very young children. And the children who saw the adults rubbing the doll, hugging the doll, nursing the doll, holding the doll's hand, they would engage in similar behaviours. They would look after the doll and they would be very kind to it. However, if the adults mistreated the doll and started beating it, punching it, or throwing it up in the air, knocking it down, or kicking it, children would do that instead. So it kind of gives some greater value to this idea, to the cliche of monkey see, monkey do. So the Bobo doll experiment spoke to that phenomenon. And now you will often hear and see people referring to this experiment in social cognitive theory against violent media and against violent games. And personally, I don't think that that's a valid argument, because the test subjects in this situation were children. And I think it's obvious that children shouldn't be exposed to violent media. And that's up to the discretion of the guardians and the parents to really protect them from different violent medias. But violent media for adults shouldn't be an issue if you are well and understand what you are watching. Ethological theory in lifespan development refers to different critical and sensitive periods. And in this we see research done on, for instance, imprinting, and different research done on goslings as well. So if you are interested in learning more about that, I would search critical periods and imprinting, and maybe its relevance to humans as well. Some very interesting research done there. Quickly, we looked at attachment theory, which was largely informed by a psychologist called John Bowlby. I won't get into that. We also looked at ecological theory, which was largely informed by a different psychologist called Bronfenbrenner. But before I leave lifespan development entirely, I'm going to mention something very interesting about mothers and their babies' cry. You may be familiar with the idea that a mother is more sensitive to her baby's cry than to the cry of other children. For instance, a mother mightn't be able to perceive something, for argument's sake, below 20 decibels. She might be able to isolate that in a noisy room. Whereas she might be able to hear that if it's her child's cry. And it shows that mothers are sensitive, particularly sensitive to their own children's cry than other children's cries. There's lots of research done on this. An interesting fact about this phenomenon is that if the mother suffers with depression, they may not have that sensitivity. It can attenuate that sensitivity. And it just, again, speaks to the value of maternal health in relationships between children and mother, and children and parents, full stop. To be living the best life for you and your child, it's important for you to be well. Moving on to my psychological health and difficulties and disorders module, we looked at a lot of things. An assignment I'm going to have for this module this semester is a group project where I'm going to record a video with 3 other people on a specific mental health topic of our interest. Now, the topic we've chosen to produce a video on, which is going to be probably 2 minutes long, is going to be on expressive writing and its efficacy in alleviating mild to moderate emotional issues in college students. So James W. Pennebaker is one of the lead researchers, kind of the founding father of this field. So if you're interested in expressive writing, check him out, and I'll likely be talking more about him and expressive writing in the weeks to come. I could go on and on and on and talk about all the different things I learned in my psychology masters this week, but I think I'm just going to leave it at that for now. And in the coming weeks, I'd love to hear from you and know whether you'd rather I look at maybe one topic in particular in more in depth, or if you want just little overviews of the different things that I learned, like I've been discussing in this week's and last week's video. Today we looked at largely at my social psychology class and my lifespan development class. Today we looked at social psychology and lifespan development, only scratching the surface. Make sure, if you're interested in any of those topics, to search them, do some of your own learning, your own reading. Tell me what you learned in the comments. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, dislike it if you didn't, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check me out on Instagram at Pat's Psychology Masters, where I'm going to be posting some interesting photos relating to psychology and doing some writing on it as well. So thanks very much for watching week 2, and I hope to see you here next week.